On his 68th birthday, a father opened a box and found a bottle of whiskey. No card, no name. Only the chilling words, "Happy Birthday," scrawled in the unmistakable hand of the son who had abandoned him 3 years earlier. It wasn't a gift. It was a wound wrapped in glass. A reminder that even blood can turn cold as ice. He stared at those letters, not with joy, but with a sinking weight that made the room feel smaller. What kind of son sends a poison of memory instead of love? Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you're watching from, because what happened next will leave you breathless. He stared at the handwriting like it was carved into stone, each letter pressed deep enough to bruise. It wasn't joy that gripped him, not even the hollow comfort of being remembered. It was something heavier, a weight that clamped across his chest like a vice. His son's hand. The very same hand he had taught to grip a hammer, to steady a fishing rod, to write his first name in blocky, uneven letters. Now that handwriting came back to him, not as a gift, but as a ghost, the curve of the letters cutting sharper than any blade. Nostalgia wrapped itself around him like barbed wire, tangled with sadness until he couldn't tell one from the other. The room seemed quieter than it had a moment before. The tick of the wall clock grew louder, sharper, each second carving out a piece of the silence. He thought back to the last time he had seen his son. No shouting, no slammed doors, no movie scene ending, just a slow unraveling, the kind you barely notice until the whole thing comes apart in your hands. A missed Sunday dinner, a skipped Thanksgiving, silence at Christmas. Silence, he realized, could become its own tradition if you let it. His eyes traced the bottle again, the glass catching the morning light, shimmering with an almost cruel beauty. It wasn't just a bottle. It was a reminder that his son knew exactly what he had given up, knew about the heart attack, the doctor's warnings, the line of things he could no longer touch if he wanted to stay alive. Yet here it was, set down like a challenge, like a test. Whiskey had once been his companion, a steady warmth at the end of a day of labor. It was never about drowning himself. It was about ceremony. The pour, the sip, the way his late wife would sit beside him on the porch swing, the night air humming with crickets, her hand brushing his as the glass passed between them. Now those memories burned more than they comforted, because she was gone, and the son who had once sat at their feet playing with toy trucks had chosen distance over devotion. He slid the bottle to the far side of the table, as if distance alone could strip it of its meaning. The card, just 2 words written in blue ink, stared back at him like a wound that refused to close. No signature, no dad, nothing personal, nothing human, just "Happy Birthday," like a stranger scribbling a note on the back of a grocery receipt. He felt the hollow space inside him grow wider. If his son had wanted to hurt him, he couldn't have chosen a sharper weapon. He reached for his coffee, now gone cold, and tasted the bitterness without sugar, without cream, just the raw edge of something that should have been warm and wasn't. That bitterness fit. It matched the taste in his mouth, the weight in his chest, the ache he couldn't name. He looked out the window at the yard that refused to stay green no matter how much he watered it. A yard where his son once played football with his friends, where the shouts of boys had once rattled the fence posts, where the grass had been torn up by sneakers and laughter. Now the yard was empty, the swing set long gone, the grass thin and stubborn, a reminder that nothing stays alive without tending. The ache tightened. It wasn't just sadness. It was the cruel recognition that what he was looking at wasn't a bridge being rebuilt, but a line being drawn. A son's gesture that felt less like an olive branch and more like a warning. He wondered if the bottle had been chosen on purpose, if his son had stood in a store aisle and thought, "This will sting him. This will remind him of what he lost, of what he can't touch anymore." Or worse, maybe his son hadn't thought of him at all. Maybe it was careless, random, detached. In some ways, that hurt more than deliberate cruelty. The memories would not leave him alone. They came rushing in, one after another, a parade of moments that now felt like they belonged to another lifetime. His son's first birthday party, a cake baked too long. The edges darkened, but his boy's face glowing with joy. Little league games where he shouted himself hoarse from the stands, only to see his son scan the crowd, to make sure he was there. High school graduation, that awkward hug in front of friends, stiff but real. College drop-off, the heavy silence in the car on the way back home, when he realized the house would never sound the same again. Each memory a blade, each recollection both precious and punishing. He leaned back in his chair, eyes on the ceiling, forcing a long breath out through his nose, steady, deliberate, like a man trying to hold back a storm. The whiskey caught the light again, the glass glowing like it held fire. He thought of his late wife, her voice telling him to be patient, to wait for their son to come around. She had always believed in second chances, always believed family could find its way back, but she wasn't here anymore, and belief felt thin without her. The clock ticked louder. The air seemed heavier. He stood, pushing his chair back slow, the scrape of the legs loud in the silence. He picked up the bottle, felt the weight of it, too heavy for glass and liquid alone. He turned it in his hands, ran his thumb over the wax seal, and set it down again with a sharp thud. The sound echoed in the kitchen like a verdict. He told himself not everything needed a reason, not every action carried intent. But he didn't believe it. His son had chosen this bottle. His son had written those words. His son had sent him something that landed in his house like a stone through glass. And for the first time in years, he felt not just sadness, but suspicion. Outside, the day was bright but cold, the kind of autumn light that promises warmth and delivers nothing but sharp air. Inside, the ache remained, steady, relentless, something that no amount of coffee or distraction could loosen. He looked again at the bottle, at the handwriting, and felt the truth press against him. This wasn't just a birthday gift. It was something else, something darker, something he couldn't name yet, but would have to face. His hand lingered on the table, fingertips brushing the plain white card, and he whispered the words out loud, testing them like they might change meaning if spoken. Happy birthday. They sounded colder in the air than they had on the page. They sounded final. He pushed the card away, stood in the center of the kitchen, and let the silence close in again. There was no comfort here, no joy, only the ache of a father who understood, perhaps too late, that some messages are not written to celebrate life, but to remind you of how fragile it is. The weight in his chest stayed with him as the day stretched on, and when the phone finally rang, hours later, he knew before answering that the story behind that bottle had only just begun. The bottle sat there on the table like a taunt, catching the morning light in a way that made it look more like a jewel than a drink. It was the kind of bottle meant to impress. Heavy glass with a green label pressed in gold, the cork sealed with deep red wax. A bottle someone might place on a high shelf to be admired by guests, something that spoke of taste, wealth, and celebration. But there was nothing to celebrate here. The father's eyes lingered on the way the light played inside the whiskey, warm amber flashing like it carried a heartbeat of its own. It was beautiful, yes, but that beauty was nothing but cruelty wrapped in glass. His son knew. He had been there in the hospital room, staring at his phone as the doctor laid out the rules for survival. No alcohol, no whiskey, no exceptions. That bottle was not a gift. It was a reminder of everything that had been stripped away when his heart had betrayed him. He ran a hand across the tabletop, fingers tracing the faint scratches left behind from years of family dinners, years of laughter, years when this house had been filled with something more than silence. Now there was only him, the table, the bottle, and the card that refused to say his name. Happy birthday. 2 words that mocked him more with every passing minute. It was the kind of cruelty that pretended to be kindness. A gesture that looked thoughtful to anyone on the outside, but cut deep for the man who had to hold it in his hands. It was expensive, carefully chosen, but chosen for the wrong reasons. He felt the insult of it pressed down harder than the weight of the glass. He remembered the last glass of whiskey he had ever poured. A quiet Sunday evening, the crickets loud in the dark, his wife still alive, her hand brushing against his as she laughed at something trivial, something that didn't matter but made the night feel whole. He had sipped it slow, the warmth spreading through him, believing there would always be more nights like that. Then came the pain in his chest, the sirens, the bright lights of the emergency room, and the cold announcement of what he could no longer have. His son had stood there, watching as the doctor told him he'd be dead within a year if he didn't change. He had nodded, agreed, promised. His son had been silent, his eyes fixed not on his father, but on the glowing screen of his phone. That memory now pressed harder against his chest than the attack itself. And now, years later, this bottle appeared. A reminder, a message, a cruel joke maybe. He picked up the card again, turning it over, half expecting something to appear on the blank side, some hidden note, some apology. But there was nothing, just emptiness, like the voice of his son when they spoke those rare times over the last 3 years, hollow, distant, stripped of any warmth. He set it down, slower this time, the weight of it far heavier than the paper should allow. His hand lingered on the surface of the table, his pulse ticking hard in his wrist. He tried to convince himself it was careless, that his son had been rushing, hadn't thought it through, hadn't remembered the doctor's warnings, that the whiskey was just a generic gift, something a man might send without much thought. But the lie tasted bitter in his mouth. His son was many things, but careless wasn't one of them. He had always been sharp, deliberate, calculating in his choices. He would have known what this meant, which made it worse. If it wasn't careless, then it was deliberate. And if it was deliberate, then what did it mean? The ache in his chest grew tighter. Not the medical kind, not the one that sent him into hospitals and sleepless nights, but the ache of knowing he was being mocked by his own flesh and blood. A son who once clung to his legs in grocery stores, who once called him a hero, who once whispered good night with a kiss on the cheek, now sending him something that felt more like a curse than a blessing. He thought of all the years of sacrifice, of late nights working shifts to pay for braces, of mornings coaching Little League, of holidays spent making sure there was always something under the tree. Every memory now stood beside that bottle, demanding to know how it had all come to this. The irony burned deeper with every second. This whiskey wasn't just something he couldn't drink. It was something he used to love, something tied to memories of peace and comfort. By sending it, his son had managed to remind him of both what he had lost and what he could never have again. It was a cruel brilliance, a gift that stabbed from 2 directions at once. To anyone else, it looked like a thoughtful gesture. To him, it was a weapon. He leaned back in his chair, the ceiling light catching faintly on the wax seal. He wondered if his son had imagined him sitting here, staring at the bottle, fighting the pull of memories and pain. Did he imagine him tempted? Did he want him to break his promise to the doctor, to his late wife, to himself? Or was this all just a cold message, a reminder that he was no longer part of his son's life in any meaningful way? That he was being acknowledged, yes, but not in love, not in respect, only in disdain. His jaw tightened. He thought of the last words his son had spoken to him, back before the silence began. Words sharp enough to slice through years of fatherhood. "You'll regret siding with them over me." At the time, he hadn't understood. He had thought it was anger, a phase, something time would smooth over. Now, with this bottle on his table, those words echoed louder, heavier. They felt connected. They felt like part of the same sentence. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor, and picked up the bottle. The glass felt cold despite the sunlight on it. He held it up, turned it slowly, let the liquid catch the light again. It gleamed, mocking him with its beauty. He thought about smashing it against the sink, letting the shards scatter across the tile. But something held him back. Not mercy, not forgiveness. Something colder. Curiosity. If his son meant for this to wound him, then why? Why now, after 3 years of silence? Why send a gift at all if the intention was cruelty? What message was hidden inside this amber glass? The thought coiled around him like smoke, impossible to shake. He set the bottle down again, more carefully this time, as though it might explode if dropped too hard. He pressed his palms flat against the table, staring at it, his breath slow, deliberate, the kind of breathing a man does when he knows he can't trust his own heartbeat. He whispered to the empty room, not expecting an answer, only needing to hear it out loud. "What are you trying to tell me, son?" The silence answered, heavy and unmoving. The clock ticked. The house held its breath. And in that stillness, he realized this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. And whatever truth was waiting, it was darker than anything he had yet dared to imagine. He could still see it as clearly as if the porch light were flicking on right now, the boards creaking under their weight, the air thick with the sound of crickets rising like a hymn from the tall grass. His wife's hand rested against his. The glass of whiskey balanced between them, a quiet ritual that needed no words. One sip each, not to get drunk, not even to feel warm, but to mark the end of a day spent together. They would sit side by side on that old swing that leaned slightly to the left, her laughter carrying in the dark when a moth batted against the bulb above them. He would tilt the glass and watch the amber catch the porch light, knowing there was nowhere else he needed to be. Those nights were gone, carried away on a breath he could never get back. Now the memory rose up like smoke, filling the kitchen and suffocating him in the present. He could hear her voice again, gentle but steady, reminding him that their son would come around, that blood had its own way of mending. She had believed that even the sharpest break could be softened with patience and love. But she wasn't here anymore, and belief without her was a hollow thing. He stared at the bottle, at the way it burned in the morning light, and felt only the cold weight of her absence. He tried to remember the last evening they had shared that ritual. The porch had been warm, the cicadas loud, her hair tucked behind her ear, in that way she always did when she wanted him to look at her and really listen. She had smiled through the rim of the glass and said, "Promise me you'll keep waiting for him." He had promised, and then the world had shifted. A sudden pain, a diagnosis, the slow unraveling of time until the swing sat empty and the glass remained untouched. His son had been there through part of it, distracted, distant, always rushing to some other place, but she had never stopped believing he would find his way back. The ghost of her presence lingered in every corner of the house, the worn chair she used to sit in while knitting, the scent of lavender clinging stubbornly to an old sweater, the box of recipes in her handwriting tucked into a drawer. And now, this bottle, a cruel reminder of what they had lost together and what he had been forced to give up alone. He reached for it, turned it slowly, let the liquid roll against the glass, and for a moment he imagined she was there again, her hand brushing his as he lifted it. But when he blinked, he was staring at his own reflection in the window, an old man clutching a gift that felt more like a curse. Grief had a way of looping back on itself, of pulling him into places he thought he had already walked through. He had learned to live with the silence of the house, the cold stretch of the bed, the mornings without her humming in the kitchen. But grief wasn't content with silence. It came roaring back at the smallest provocation. A bottle, a smell, the sound of crickets echoing in memory. And this time, it came paired with longing so sharp it left him breathless. Longing not just for her, but for the years when his family had still felt whole, for the boy who had once run across the yard with scraped knees, who had once asked if he could have a sip of Dad's drink just to feel grown up, for the young man who had looked at him with something like admiration, before life hardened into resentment and distance. He sat down heavily, the chair groaning beneath him, and placed the bottle in front of him like it was a guest at the table. His wife would have hated the silence between him and their son. She would have forced conversation, nudged them back toward each other, refused to let bitterness take root. She had been the bridge between them, and without her, the gap had only widened. He traced the rim of the glass with his finger, feeling the smooth curve, and let the memories keep coming. The Sunday roast she used to cook, the sound of football games on the TV while their son sprawled on the rug, her voice rising above the noise to tell them both to keep it civil when they teased each other too far. It all seemed like another man's life, one he could watch but never touch again. The longing turned into something darker, a gnawing emptiness that no memory could fill, no gesture could erase. He wondered if that was the intention behind the gift, to remind him of what he no longer had, to cut open wounds that had never healed. His son had chosen this whiskey, had sent it knowing the weight it carried, knowing the memories it would stir. Was it a punishment, a warning, or something else entirely? He didn't know, but the question sat heavy in his gut, more unsettling than the silence itself. He poured himself a cup of coffee, black and bitter, but even that tasted of the past. She used to slip in just a touch of cream when he wasn't looking, claiming it softened him. He had laughed, called it unnecessary, but secretly liked the way she fussed over him. He sipped now, alone, the bitterness coating his tongue, and realized how far gone those days were. The ghosts weren't just haunting him, they were mocking him. He set the coffee down, leaned back, and closed his eyes. The porch, the crickets, her laughter. They played on a loop until he opened his eyes again and found only the bottle waiting. The silence pressed down harder, the emptiness deeper, and he knew then that this gift wasn't just careless. It was designed to remind him of all he could never reclaim. A son who had chosen distance, a wife who could no longer bridge the divide, a life that had slipped out of reach. But underneath the grief, beneath the longing, something else stirred. Suspicion, sharp and cold, threading itself through the sorrow. His son hadn't reached out in 3 years. No calls, no letters, no presents at holidays. And then suddenly this. A gift too expensive, too deliberate, too pointed. It wasn't just the ghosts of the past that haunted this bottle. It was the shadow of something darker. He looked again at the card, at those 2 empty words, "Happy Birthday." They stared back at him like an accusation, like a secret waiting to be uncovered. And as the house settled around him, each creak and sigh whispering in the quiet, he felt the truth take shape inside him. This wasn't about nostalgia. This wasn't about remembrance. It was about something far more dangerous. The ache of loss still clung to him, but now it mixed with unease, with the unmistakable sense that the bottle on his table carried more than just whiskey. It carried a message, and soon he would have no choice but to find out what it meant. The silence had not arrived like a storm. It had crept in quietly, the way dust gathers on a shelf when no one is watching. There was no shouting match, no slammed door, no dramatic final scene a stranger could point to and say, "That's when it all ended." It happened slower, subtler, so quiet that he barely noticed until the damage was complete. One Sunday, his son missed dinner, claiming work. The next month, Thanksgiving passed without him at the table, no phone call, not even a message. By the second Christmas, the seat that had once belonged to him was left empty, and the father realized the silence had hardened into something permanent. Silence, he thought, has a way of becoming its own kind of habit, a ritual of absence. At first, he had waited for the call, the knock at the door, some small gesture to remind him that the bond still existed. He had prepared extra plates at dinner, told himself his son might walk in late, imagined the sound of boots on the porch. The waiting had weight, a steady ache that pressed harder with each holiday that slipped by. But eventually, waiting gave way to resignation. The extra plates stayed in the cupboard. The porch remained still, and the silence grew louder, filling every corner of the house until even the ticking of the wall clock sounded like mockery. Loneliness became his shadow. It followed him from room to room, curling up on the empty side of the bed, pulling out the chair across from him at the table, sitting in the passenger seat of the truck when he drove into town. It was a presence more constant than his son had ever been in those last years. Sometimes he would catch himself speaking out loud, muttering a thought or a memory, only to hear his own voice bounce back hollow against the walls. That echo was worse than silence. It was proof of his abandonment. He thought back to the small traditions they had once shared. Sunday morning pancakes, Friday night games on the TV, small talk on the drive to school. None of them had ended with finality. They had simply dissolved, one by one, until there was nothing left but empty space. A father's voice asking questions that were never answered. A father's hand reaching out, finding only air. He had once believed that love, especially a parent's love, was unshakable. That no matter the distance, no matter the disagreements, blood would always bring them back together. But the silence proved him wrong. It revealed the fragility of bonds he had thought unbreakable, showing him that neglect could be just as powerful as anger. The absence of words, of visits, of care, it cut deeper than any argument could have. The bottle on the table was proof of that cruel truth. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't an attempt to bridge the gap. It was a performance, a gesture that required no presence, no conversation, no effort. A hollow offering wrapped in glass and wax. Expensive, yes, but empty of meaning. His son had not come himself, had not called, had not written more than 2 words. Happy birthday. That was what 3 years of silence amounted to. A gift that mocked him more than it soothed. He remembered the last time they had spoken. The words had been clipped, ordinary, nothing that suggested finality. His son had mentioned work, promised to come by soon, and then he was gone. That was all. No dramatic betrayal, no shouted accusations, just a slow fade into nothing. And yet, here he was, 3 years later, with a bottle in front of him like a tombstone marking the death of their relationship. The abandonment cut deeper because it was invisible. There was no fight to point to, no wound to bandage, only the steady erosion of connection until there was nothing left. It was like watching paint peel from a wall, slow and relentless, leaving behind only bare wood. And in that emptiness, he found himself questioning everything. Had he failed as a father? Had he not given enough? Or had he given too much? Had he driven his son away with silence of his own? These questions gnawed at him in the small hours of the night when the house was too quiet and the memories too loud. He often thought of his late wife during those hours, how she would have handled it differently. She would have refused to let the silence stand. She would have called, demanded, insisted on visits, filled the gap with her presence until it could not grow so wide. She had been the bridge between them, and without her, the distance had widened unchecked. He sometimes wondered if his son blamed him for her death, or if it was simpler than that, if indifference had just replaced love. Now, staring at the whiskey, he felt the weight of that abandonment pressing harder than ever. The bottle wasn't a gift. It was a reminder that even when his son reached out, he did it from a distance, safe behind walls of silence. No phone call, no visit, no effort to face the father he had left behind. Just 2 words and a bottle he could never use. He leaned back in his chair, the house groaning faintly in the autumn wind, and let the silence wash over him again. It was not the silence of peace or rest. It was the silence of absence, the silence of something missing that could never be replaced. He had lived with it long enough to know its shape, its weight, its sting, and now, with the bottle on the table, that silence had found a new voice. It whispered to him that the past was gone, that the connection was severed, that the distance between them was no longer an accident, but a choice. Yet beneath the loneliness, beneath the ache of abandonment, something else stirred. The thought that silence could also hide secrets. That distance wasn't just neglect, but perhaps design. That maybe his son's absence was not just the result of apathy, but the preparation for something darker. The gift, the timing, the cruel irony of it all. It gnawed at him in a way the silence never had before. He looked again at the bottle, at the card, at the empty chair across from him, and felt the truth gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. The silence had spoken long enough. Now it was time to listen to what it was hiding. He sat at the table a long while, the whiskey bottle catching the light in slow, steady flashes, like a lighthouse beam on a deserted coast. Every angle of that glass reminded him of something lost. His wife's laughter, his son's absence, the sound of crickets on a night when life still had sweetness to it. He could not drink it. He would not drink it. But leaving it there, letting it gather dust on the counter like a trophy of humiliation, that was worse. The ache inside his chest pressed down until he finally pushed back his chair, the decision already made before he spoke it aloud. If the bottle had no place in his house, then it belonged somewhere else. Henry Miller's name came to him without hesitation. A man of steady hands, a man who carried strength without boasting. Henry was the kind of friend who never needed to be asked for help because he simply showed up. When a storm had torn shingles from the roof, Henry was on a ladder by 8 the next morning, hammer in hand. When winter had frozen the pipes, he was there with a wrench before the ice had time to melt. He never came empty-handed, never asked for anything in return. He didn't talk much, didn't crowd a man's silence, but his presence had weight, the kind that anchored you when everything else felt like it was drifting away. It felt right. The bottle would not sit as a cruel reminder in his kitchen. It would be a gift to someone who deserved it, a man who had earned his respect a dozen times over. The thought brought the faintest sense of relief, a loosening of the tension that had coiled around his chest since the package arrived. Gratitude, rare and quiet, surfaced in him for the first time that day. By mid-afternoon, he placed the bottle on the passenger seat of his truck. Buckled in, almost like it was alive, almost like it needed protecting. The leather seat creaked under the weight, and he couldn't shake the unease of having it there beside him, its amber liquid catching slivers of sun through the windshield. The road stretched ahead, familiar and lonely, lined with fields turning brown under the October light. The smell of smoke from a burn pile drifted across the highway, faint but sharp enough to stir something restless in him. As he drove, his mind wandered to Henry again, to all the small ways the man had stood by him. They weren't brothers, not by blood, but sometimes friendship felt more binding than family. Henry never asked questions about the son's silence, never pressed for details. He would just sit, share a coffee, and talk about weather, repairs, or nothing at all. In that quiet strength, there was a comfort no expensive bottle could buy. It felt good, necessary even, to hand this gesture over to someone who might truly appreciate it. When he pulled into Henry's drive, gravel crunching beneath his tires, the familiar white house stood like a sentinel at the edge of town. The porch wrapped around it in a wide embrace, and the smell of sawdust and wood shavings floated faintly in the air, proof that Henry had been working on something again. The screen door swung open before he could knock. Henry stood there in a red flannel shirt, jeans dusty from labor, his boots marked with fresh cuts of wood. His eyes, steady as always, went straight to the bottle in the father's hands. "Frank," Henry said, his brows lifting, "what's this?" "A gift," he answered simply, holding the bottle out. "From my son. But I think you'll enjoy it more than I would." Henry took it slowly, turning the bottle in his calloused hands, reading the label with the kind of appreciation only a man who worked with his hands could have for fine things. "This is something," he murmured, "not the kind you drink on an ordinary night." "Then make tonight special," the father said, the corner of his mouth tightening in something close to a smile. Henry's grin was small but genuine, the kind that reached his eyes. "I think I will. Thank you, Frank. Truly." The relief washed through him deeper this time, not just from the act of giving the bottle away, but from the way Henry received it, with respect, without questions, without judgment. It was a simple exchange, but it carried weight. The bottle was no longer a wound festering in his kitchen. It had become a gesture of gratitude, a quiet offering to a man who had stood by him in ways his own blood no longer did. Driving home, the late lights slanted across the dashboard, painting the world in amber tones that matched the whiskey's glow. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to believe the matter was finished, that the gift had been redirected, the sting dulled, the ghosts put back in their corners. He turned down the familiar road toward his house, the hum of the engine steady, the fields stretching wide and empty on either side. But the thought lingered, stubborn and sharp, gnawing at him from the back of his mind. His son was not careless. His son never sent anything without a reason. The man who had once borrowed cash for gas, who never spent money unless forced, had suddenly chosen an expensive bottle of whiskey as a birthday gift. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening in the glow of the setting sun. It didn't fit. It didn't make sense. He told himself to let it go, to accept the relief of having the bottle out of his house. But the unease refused to quiet. The silence in the truck grew heavier with each passing mile, louder than the rumble of the tires on the road. The gift was gone from his possession, but the question of why it had been sent remained, pressing against him like a stone in his chest. He parked in his driveway as the last of the daylight faded, the porch light casting a weak glow across the front steps. The house looked the same as it always had, but it felt different now, as if something had shifted in the walls while he was gone. He stood in the doorway a long time before stepping inside, the quiet greeting him like an old enemy. The bottle was no longer in his hands, but its shadow lingered. Its meaning, its intent, its weight, all of it followed him into the house, into the silence, into the night. And though he didn't know it yet, what he had given away had not freed him. It had only bound him tighter to what was coming next. The memory of Henry on the ladder came back with a clarity that made the present feel thinner, like it was only a fragile film stretched over something stronger. That summer storm had hit hard, rain slashing sideways, wind tearing shingles loose like scraps of paper. By morning, half the roof was stripped bare, and he had stood in the yard, staring up at the damage, calculating costs, the ache in his chest as heavy as the clouds still hanging low. Before he had even reached for the phone, Henry's truck rattled up the drive. No call, no request. Just a man stepping out with a hammer in one hand and nails in the other. He remembered the sound of boots on wet gravel, Henry's steady voice cutting through the damp air. "Figured you'd need a hand." No fanfare, no performance, just quiet certainty. By 8 o'clock, Henry was halfway across the roof, pounding nails in a rhythm that carried more reassurance than any words could. He hadn't needed to ask. He hadn't needed to explain. Henry knew, and Henry acted. That was the measure of him. As he drove away from Henry's house that afternoon, the bottle now out of his possession, he thought of that day again. The way Henry had braced against the wind. How he'd refused to climb down even when the rain returned, muttering only that he'd rather finish than leave it half done. That kind of loyalty was rare. Most men showed up when it was convenient, when it cost them nothing. Henry showed up when it was hard. He was the kind of man who carried weight for others without complaint, who fixed what was broken because leaving it broken wasn't in his nature. The father's grip tightened on the wheel as the road wound back toward home. In the silence of the truck, the contrast became unbearable. A friend who showed up without being asked, who hammered nails in a roof he didn't live under, who never let a man stand alone against the storm, and a son who had disappeared into silence, who offered nothing but 2 words on a card and a bottle that cut deeper than kindness. The divide between them stretched wide, and the ache of it pressed hard against his ribs. He let the memory play on. Henry's laughter drifting down from the roof when he slipped and nearly lost a hammer. The way he'd clapped him on the shoulder after the work was done, sweat dripping down his temples, saying, "That'll hold. You're good for another 20 years." It wasn't just the roof Henry had fixed that day. It was the reminder that loyalty hadn't vanished from the world, that some men still carried it like a second skin. And for that, he had always trusted Henry, always admired him. The trust made it easier to hand over the bottle, to let it leave his house and his sight. In Henry's hands, it wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a gift, a token of gratitude for all the times he had stood steady when the storms came. That thought brought him a rare moment of peace, a sense that the gesture had landed where it belonged. But peace never stayed long these days. It always slipped away, leaving unease in its wake. By the time he pulled into his own driveway, the light had shifted to dusk, shadows stretching across the yard. He shut off the engine, sat in the stillness, and thought of Henry raising a glass that night, savoring a drink meant for another man. The image should have brought him comfort, but it didn't. It unsettled him. Because beneath the admiration, beneath the trust, there was still that gnawing question. Why had his son chosen that bottle in the first place? Why now, after years of silence? Inside the house, the quiet pressed harder. He walked past the table where the bottle had sat that morning, the wood bare now, but the imprint of its presence still lingering in the air. He could almost see it there, gleaming in the light, whispering secrets he hadn't yet uncovered. He thought again of Henry on the roof, the steadiness of his hand, the certainty of his presence. If there was one man who didn't deserve to carry the shadow of his son's choices, it was Henry. He poured himself a glass of water, sat in the same chair, and stared at the empty space across from him. The house creaked softly in the evening wind, and he felt the weight of loyalty and betrayal battling inside him. One man had given more than he ever asked for. The other had given nothing but silence and a bottle that might not be what it seemed. The trust he placed in Henry was unshakable, but the admiration he felt for his friend only deepened the disappointment in his own blood. He wondered what Henry would think if he knew the truth, if he knew how deliberate that gift felt, how sharp its irony, how dangerous its timing. Would Henry still raise his glass without suspicion, or would he pause, like the father now paused, sensing something darker at work? The thought refused to let him rest. He stood, paced the kitchen, the boards creaking beneath his feet. The silence of the house was no longer just lonely. It was tense, heavy, waiting for something to happen. He thought of calling Henry, of asking him to set the bottle aside, to hold it until they could talk. But he didn't, not yet. Instead, he sat back down, pressed his palms flat against the table, and whispered into the emptiness, "Don't let me be right about this." The night stretched on, the quiet unbroken, but his mind would not still. He kept circling back to the same image. Henry, loyal and steady, lifting a glass of amber liquid that should have stayed sealed. And behind that image, the face of his son, expressionless, distant, a shadow he could no longer read. The trust he felt for Henry remained intact. But trust, he realized, could not erase suspicion. It could not silence the unease that had taken root. And deep down, he knew that the bottle he had given away had not left him free. It had only placed the weight of its secret in another man's hands. The clock ticked on, each second louder than the last. He sat in the kitchen until the moonlight edged across the floor, knowing that the past had returned. The silence had spoken, and the gift he had passed along was not finished with him. Not by a long shot. The decision came without noise, without ceremony, the way a tree falls in the woods when no one is there to hear it. He had spent hours staring at that bottle, letting the light bend through its amber heart, letting the silence weigh heavier with every tick of the clock. It was beautiful, yes, but beauty was not the same as belonging. In his house, on his table, it was nothing but a thorn wrapped in glass. To keep it would be to let the wound fester, to let the message behind it sit and rot in his kitchen like an accusation. So he gave it away. Handing it to Henry had felt like lifting a stone from his chest. The weight had shifted instantly, not gone, but lessened, as though loyalty could carry what blood had cast aside. Henry had smiled, grateful, respectful, exactly the way a man like him would. And in that moment, for the first time all day, the father had felt something close to satisfaction. Quiet, unassuming, but real. The bottle had found a place where it could be more than a cruel reminder. It could be an offering, a gesture of respect for a man who had never failed him. The relief lingered as he drove back home, the road long and familiar, the truck humming steady beneath him. The sky had turned the color of old copper, streaked with the last light of day, and the air smelled faintly of smoke from a neighbor's burn pile. He gripped the wheel, the leather worn smooth from years of use, and told himself he had done the right thing, that the bottle was no longer his burden, that he had turned something bitter into something worthwhile. But even as he pulled into his driveway, the satisfaction carried an edge. He stepped into the house, flicked on the porch light the way his late wife had always insisted, and the silence rushed to greet him like an old adversary. The table where the bottle had sat looked naked now, stripped of its burden, but also stripped of meaning. He sat in the chair, the wood groaning under his weight, and stared at the empty space as though it still held a shadow. He thought again of Henry's steady hand gripping the bottle, of the quiet gratitude in his voice, and he knew he had honored the right man. Henry had been there when storms tore shingles from the roof, when pipes froze solid, when loneliness pressed too hard. His son had been absent, distant, unreachable. So yes, giving the bottle away had been the better choice. Dust would have gathered on it here, along with resentment, with grief. But in Henry's house, it would be opened, shared, appreciated, given a story. That mattered. That made the decision feel less like surrender and more like resolve. He leaned back, hands folded in his lap, the air heavy with the smell of coffee grounds left in the pot. A faint breeze pressed against the window, rattling it in the frame, and he let his eyes close for a moment. He pictured Henry setting the bottle on his own table, the glass catching the glow of lamplight, his wife's face lighting up at the sight of it, his friends nodding in approval. He wanted to believe it would be nothing more than that, a gift that found the right hands, a small piece of respect passed between men. But his mind would not stay quiet. It circled back to the beginning, to the weight of the package on his porch, to the card with 2 words scrawled in familiar ink. Happy birthday. No name, no warmth, no voice behind them. His son had chosen this bottle deliberately. That much he could not shake. It was not careless. It was not thoughtless. It had been sent for a reason. And now that reason sat in Henry's house instead of his. The satisfaction of honoring his friend dulled under the edge of unease. He stood, moved to the window, and looked out at the yard. The grass was patchy, the swing set long gone, the lemon tree his wife had planted years ago drooping under neglect. Every piece of it felt like a monument to something slipping away. He pressed his palm to the cool glass, stared at his reflection, and told himself the decision had been right. It had been clean. The bottle was no longer his to bear, but the questions it carried had not left with it. They had settled deeper inside him, quieter but sharper, waiting. The night stretched on. He ate a simple meal, washed the plate, sat again at the table. The house was too still, too heavy. He reached for the card, still lying there, and read the words again. Happy birthday. He whispered them aloud, and they sounded colder spoken than written. He slid the card back under a stack of old letters, burying it where it couldn't stare at him anymore. But even hidden, it pulsed at the edge of his thoughts. Giving the bottle away had been the only choice that made sense. He could not drink it. He could not let it sit and rot in the corner of his vision. Passing it on had been a way to reclaim control, to turn cruelty into respect. And for a time, that was enough. But resolve, he realized, was not the same as closure. Resolve was just the act of moving forward without answers. Satisfaction was temporary. The questions remained. He turned off the kitchen light, climbed the stairs, and sat on the edge of the bed that still carried the faint impression of his wife. He thought again of her voice, the way she would have scolded him for second-guessing himself, the way she would have told him to focus on what he could control. He imagined her telling him that honoring Henry was a better use of the bottle than letting it rot in bitterness. He wanted to believe her, but the silence of the house answered louder than memory. He lay back, the ceiling fan spinning shadows across the plaster, and tried to let sleep take him. But sleep stayed just out of reach, the questions pacing in the dark like restless animals. His son had not called, not visited, not spoken to him in years. And now, suddenly, this. A bottle he could not use, a gesture too sharp to be kindness. It did not fit. It did not rest. The resolve remained, quiet and steady, the only thing he could hold on to. He had given the bottle away. He had honored a man who deserved it. He had taken control of something that had been meant to wound him. That was enough, for now. But as the night deepened, as the wind pressed harder against the windows, and the house groaned in its bones, he knew this decision had not closed the chapter. It had only turned the page. And whatever came next The bottle he had passed on would not let him walk away untouched. The road stretched long and familiar, a ribbon of cracked asphalt running through open fields that looked more like faded photographs than living land. The bottle sat upright in the passenger seat, seatbelt strapped across its chest as if it were a passenger with secrets of its own. The father kept his eyes on the road, but his gaze flicked back again and again to the gleam of amber in the fading light. It looked too alive, too deliberate, like it had been placed there to remind him he wasn't alone, even when he was. The thought gnawed at him, sharper with each mile. His son had never been one to spend money easily. He was practical to the point of stinginess, measuring dollars with the same cold precision he used to measure words. Birthdays had always meant something simple: a card bought at the last minute, a shirt that didn't quite fit. Sometimes nothing at all, except an apology wrapped in excuses. But this was different. This bottle was rare, expensive, chosen with care. Yet it had been sent to a man who could never drink it, who had been told by doctors that even a sip might send him back to the emergency room. The gesture made no sense unless it wasn't a gesture at all, unless it was something else. He tightened his grip on the wheel, the leather worn smooth under his palm. The hum of the truck should have been steadying, but every vibration only made his suspicion hum louder. He tried to tell himself it was guilt talking, the kind of suspicion grief plants when silence stretches too long. But deep down he knew better. His son had not forgotten. His son had been there in the hospital, had signed the discharge papers, had heard every word from the doctor's mouth. The warning had been clear: no alcohol, ever. And yet, here it was, buckled neatly beside him, like a taunt disguised as generosity. The bottle caught the dying sun, throwing slashes of gold across the dashboard. He remembered another drive years ago, when his boy sat in that same passenger seat, no seatbelt, hair wild in the wind, laughing at some private joke. He had reached across to ruffle his hair, to remind him to buckle up, and the boy had swatted his hand away with a grin. That memory used to bring warmth. Now it cut deep, the innocence of it mocking the suspicion that wrapped tighter around him now. What had changed? When had the boy who once trusted him with every scraped knee become the man who sent gifts that felt like weapons? He pressed harder on the gas, the engine groaning as if resisting the pace. The silence in the cab was louder than the rumble of the tires, louder than the wind cutting through the cracked seal of the window. He wanted to roll it down, let the cold air whip through and clear his head. But something in him refused. It felt too much like inviting the suspicion to speak out loud, to fill the cab with words he wasn't ready to hear. The question would not leave him. Why this bottle? Why now? If it had been an olive branch, a gesture of peace, it would have come with words, with presence, with something more than ink scrawled across a blank card. If it had been thoughtless, it would have been cheaper, quicker, careless in its choice. This was neither. This was deliberate. And the deliberation chilled him more than the autumn air pressing against the glass. The headlights of another car swept across the road, catching the bottle in its beam. For an instant, the liquid inside glowed blood red, not gold. His breath caught. He gritted his teeth and told himself it was nothing but light and glass, a trick of the angle. Still, the image lodged itself in his chest, heavy and immovable. He reached across the seat and adjusted the bottle, as if changing its position might change the way it felt. It didn't. The suspicion clung to him, steady as his own shadow. He thought again of Henry, of the way his friend had taken the bottle without question, with nothing but gratitude. He pictured him now, maybe setting it on his counter, maybe planning to open it after dinner. The thought should have brought comfort, but it twisted instead. A loyal man like Henry deserved better than to carry something that carried unease. The father's stomach tightened at the idea that he might have passed on more than a gift. that he might have passed on something dangerous, something meant to harm. The thought shook him, but he did not slow down. The road narrowed, lined with bare trees that looked skeletal in the fading light. Their branches clawed at the sky, scratching against the last strips of daylight like ink bleeding across paper. He drove through the shadows, his eyes locked ahead, but the question gnawed louder than ever. What was his son trying to say with this bottle? What was hidden behind two empty words and a gift that mocked his condition? The truck rattled as it crossed a stretch of uneven pavement. The bottle shifted, seatbelt tugging it back against the seat with a dull thud. The sound made him flinch, as if the glass had spoken. He cursed under his breath, shook his head, tried to push the thought away. But it stayed, thick and unyielding, the way fog lingers in low fields, long after the sun has burned away. By the time Henry's porch light came into view, the unease had settled into him like a second skin. He told himself to breathe, to steady his hands, to remember that not every gift carried malice, not every gesture was a threat. But the truth echoed louder in the back of his mind, a truth he could not shake. His son had not spent this money by accident. He had not chosen this bottle without reason. And until that reason revealed itself, the father knew peace would remain out of reach. He pulled into the gravel drive, the stones crunching under the tires like bones. The bottle gleamed faintly in the glow of the porch light, innocent in its beauty, merciless in its silence. He unbuckled it carefully, the belt sliding back with a hiss, and held it in his hands. It felt heavier than glass and liquid should, as if it carried something unseen, something meant for more than a toast. He walked toward the porch, each step sinking deeper into the suspicion that had been gnawing at him since the package first arrived. And though he handed it off with a steady smile, though Henry accepted it with gratitude, the unease did not leave him. It followed him back to the truck, back to the long dark road, back into the silence of his house. The bottle was gone, but the questions it carried rode with him still. And somewhere deep down, he already knew he had not passed the burden on at all. He had only set the stage for what was yet to come. He didn't know it that night, sitting alone in his kitchen with the house creaking around him. But the bottle he had passed on would circle back like a shadow he could never outrun. He had convinced himself it was finished, that the weight was no longer his to bear, that giving it to Henry had closed the chapter. Yet in the stillness of those hours, when the wind rattled the windows and the pipes groaned deep in the walls, he felt something colder pressing in. It wasn't relief, it was dread. The days that followed unfolded in fragments, each moment heavy with unease. He went about his routines, coffee at dawn, walks through the yard, the quiet maintenance of a house too big for one man. But the silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like warning. Every creak in the floorboards, every groan of the furnace, carried the same whisper. You haven't seen the worst of it yet. When the phone finally rang, his chest tightened before he even answered. Henry's voice was strained, different from the calm steadiness he had always known. He spoke in clipped words, breathless, like each one cost him something. The bottle had been opened, poured, tasted. And then something went wrong. So wrong that by the time help arrived, Henry had collapsed against the table, his wife screaming his name. The father's stomach turned to ice as Henry's words cracked through the line. Weaker now, barely a whisper. It wasn't whiskey, Frank. The sound of that voice would echo for days after, haunting him in every corner of the house. He dropped the receiver, his knees buckling beneath him, the weight of the truth crashing down all at once. The gift wasn't careless, it wasn't thoughtless. It had been deliberate. Poison dressed as generosity, a curse wrapped in glass. He remembered strapping that bottle into the passenger seat, the sunlight turning its contents into fire. And now he saw it differently. He saw it as a weapon he had carried willingly, oblivious to the blade hidden inside. He thought of how close it had come to his own lips, how close it had sat on his table, glowing in the light of a house that had already buried too much. The dread thickened until he could barely breathe. And then another thought struck him harder than the first. If Henry hadn't taken it, if the bottle had stayed in his kitchen, it wouldn't have been Henry gasping for breath. It would have been him. The realization hollowed him out, left him trembling with the knowledge that his son hadn't just sent him a gift meant to wound. He had sent him death, dressed in red wax and amber light. The betrayal cut deeper than any silence ever had. He saw every missed dinner, every skipped holiday, every year of absence in a new light. Not neglect, not distance, but calculation, patience, a slow build toward this. His son had not forgotten him. His son had not abandoned him. His son had been waiting, planning, crafting the gesture that would end it all. The father's hands shook as he pressed them against the table, steadying himself against the spinning room. The ghosts of the past pressed closer, his wife's voice echoing warnings he had never understood until now. Blood ties had become chains. Family had become threat. And the silence that once wounded him now revealed itself as something sharper. The silence of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Fear surged through him, not just for himself, but for Henry. For the man who had stood on his roof in the rain, who had taken the bottle without suspicion, who now lay in a hospital bed because of a gift meant for another. The weight of guilt crashed harder than the fear itself. He had passed the burden on, but not the danger. And now both of them carried scars that could not be erased. He paced the kitchen in the hours after the call, the house too small to contain the storm rising in him. Every shadow felt alive, every sound in the dark charged with menace. The betrayal wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't ink on a card or silence across years. It was poison in a bottle. It was murder wrapped as kindness. And it had almost succeeded. The dread deepened into something colder. Resolve. He knew now this wasn't the end. It wasn't even the climax. It was the opening act, the first strike in a game he hadn't realized he was playing. His son had sent a message, and the message had nearly killed him. But the fact that he was still standing meant the story wasn't finished. He leaned against the window, looking out at the yard bathed in weak moonlight, and whispered into the dark. Not with grief this time, but with a promise. You should have finished it when you had the chance. His breath fogged the glass, the words lingering in the cold night air like smoke from a gun. He sat back down, the card still tucked under a stack of letters, the memory of Henry's voice clawing at his chest. He knew now what the bottle had been, what it had nearly done, and more than that, he knew it was only the beginning. Don't forget to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because the next part of this story will drag you deeper, and once you hear it, you'll understand just how far blood will go when it turns against you. Sometimes the deepest wounds don't come from strangers, but from the people we once trusted most. This story is more than suspense. It's a reminder that trust should never be blind, even within family. As we grow older, it becomes essential to protect not only our health and independence, but also the values and assets we've worked for our entire lives. The father's near tragedy shows us how important it is to stay alert, to question what seems too polished, and to recognize that loyalty is proven through actions, not words or expensive gifts. True friendship, like Henry's quiet presence, can often shine brighter than the bonds of blood that have turned cold. For older adults, this is a call to stay cautious, to cherish the people who genuinely care, and to safeguard yourself against betrayal, no matter where it comes from. Life may be quieter with age, but it should never be lived in fear or silence. Choose trust carefully and never mistake absence for safety. If this story made you think about loyalty, family, and the strength to protect yourself, don't forget to subscribe and share where you're watching from. Your perspective matters here.